Hi everyone. Uh, Welcome to our webinar on expanding your franchise network, best practices for recruiting top franchisees. My name is Corinne Whelan and I'm a practice leader in LegalVision's franchising team, and I'm joined today by Doug Downer, who is the principal of Franchise Ready. Doug, do you want to just explain a little bit about what Franchise Ready is?
Absolutely. Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. Franchise Ready is a franchise consulting business. So we work with both emerging franchisors and established franchisors. We've launched 150 brands into Australia. We'll launch 40 brands this year, and then we're supporting about 30 brands with their recruitment. So we sort of do a little bit of everything that a franchise system needs in order to go from where they are to where they want to be.
Cool. Thanks. So before we begin today, I'm just going to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. So you'll receive the recording and slides in your email. You're welcome to submit your questions in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end. And then please complete the feedback survey after the webinar. Also, all attendees are going to be eligible to receive a free consultation with us to discuss how we can help you with your contracts or any of your legal needs. Anyone who requests this free consult will also receive a copy of Doug's latest franchise book, Invested. So to request your free consultation, provide us with your contact details in the survey that appears at the end of this webinar. Cool. So today we're going to be, looking at a few different things. The first thing we're going to be talking about is planning for your expansion. We're going to look at mapping and marketing your expansion. We're going to look at recruitment processes, the commercial and legal considerations as part of that recruitment process. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at the end, we'll be doing some Q&A. So we'll be answering all your questions. So please submit your questions throughout the webinar through the chat function, and then we'll answer them all at the end. So now Doug's just going to start us off by speaking about planning for your expansion.
Great, thanks, Corinne. I think for us, it's really about clearly articulating what is the strategy in terms of how do you want to grow the franchise network. And it starts with that premise that you never actually, this sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but you never sell a franchise. You're really in the business of granting a franchise to the right franchise partner. So there's got to be some rigor in that process, because the valuation of a franchise business is really determined by the recurring revenue model, so the royalties that you generate, and that comes from having the right franchisees. There's often a temptation to get the initial fee, and that's nice, but I really see that initial fee as your marketing spend to attract the right franchisee so that you can get an optimum performance out of the business. So once you have that premise of you're granting rather than selling, then you need to have a really good story. You need to be able to communicate that story in an authentic way, not too salesy, but you need to be really clear about who you are, what your brand is, what's a perfect franchisee look like, but also what's your point of difference. So if you're in the food category, how do you compare with other food operators in terms of investment or return on capital? So the more knowledge you can have about your sector, the better. And then if someone comes up to you at a party and says, so tell me, what do? You've got to have that 30-second story and have it really nailed and really articulate what is your USP, why are you different from every other franchise opportunity. Once you know that story, then you need to know, well, what does a perfect or a good franchisee look like? So there's certain ways that you can identify that. So Greg Nathan's got the franchise lab, he's got a new survey out, and then there's a Zoracle report, which are designed specifically for the franchise sector to identify, values, culture fit, drivers, motivators, and is somebody suited to single site, multi-site, or are they suited to business and franchising together? So identify what does an ideal profile look like, what's your franchise avatar, and then how do you actually assess any prospective franchisee against that avatar? The last thing I want to leave you with on this section around getting your recruitment strategy right is really looking at what you're currently doing, and if it's working, obviously keep doing it, and if it's not, what do you need to do to change? So we're an outsourced provider for recruitment. I mentioned earlier we recruit for about 30 brands, and we end up being a part of the team of the brands that we work with. So you would call us the external recruiters. If you're currently working and doing all your recruitment internally, and it's not working, then maybe it's worth looking at doing something different and looking at, is there potential to use an external agency to help you to do that? One of the things we've seen doing quite a bit of travel internationally, because we're bringing international brands in and taking international brand or Australian brands internationally, is how the model works in other parts of the world. So Australia really focuses on a single unit franchise model primarily, that mum and pop. But what we're seeing a lot of, particularly in the UK, Europe, and the US, is multi-unit franchisees or area developers. So maybe think about that in terms of your overall strategy for recruitment. The other interesting thing is looking at, and I know Baker's Delight has done this for a long time, they have a program called Manage to Own, which is basically bringing managers into the business and giving them the opportunity to learn the business and then acquire a business. I noticed an advertising campaign that went up by Express Personnel that Arthur posted yesterday. And it's about recruiting people, and they're a recruitment business, recruiting people into the business and then cash flowing them into the business and providing them funding for their express model. So looking at doing something differently, really focus on the quality of the candidate as opposed to the person that may have the money. I mean, there's an old saying in franchising, if they've got a pulse and they've got money in their pocket, then you should recruit them. But really it goes back to that foundation of, the value of your franchise system is the value of the recurring revenue, and that comes from having the right franchisees. So recruit on talent, not on funds. Obviously funds are important because you don't want people to be undercapitalized, but really recruit on the talent. And if there's an opportunity to promote from within and provide succession planning, that's a really good strategy in terms of the people you already know, and you provide them the opportunity. And we're seeing a lot of franchisors providing vendor finance for the right people as well. So that's the strategy piece. Once we get the strategy right, and we know, I guess, the foundations, then the next thing I want to talk about is the financial model or the business model for the franchise system. And this is very important that the franchisors understand, what are the key performance indicators in the business, and what is the financial model. So when we, we'll launch 40 brands this year. When a prospective franchisor comes to us, we look at three key considerations. I'm going to talk about two of them as they relate to franchise recruitment. So the first thing we look at is, what is the business model? What's the product or service that the client offers? How is it differentiated from other competitors in the marketplace? And what is that USP? So that goes back to the storytelling. But then from a financial perspective, how much is it going to cost a franchisee to get into the network? And then what's their likely return on capital? And so we create a financial modeling tool that we make available. And I'm going to hand over to Corinne, and Corinne's going to talk about what you can and can't say as it relates to, representations and the financial piece. But actually having a financial model is really important for the prospective franchisee to understand what's possible.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So obviously, yes, having a financial model is good, but the way you get that information and provide it to franchisees is really crucial, particularly in Australia where franchising is quite regulated. So we often recommend, not making financial projections on behalf of prospective franchisees. If your projections are inaccurate, this would be considered a misrepresentation and would be grounds for the franchisee to make a claim against you. So the prospective franchisee should be encouraged to work with an accountant to make their own projections. That's just going to be a better off, for you and for them. And it also allows them to actually be thinking about how they're planning for the model as well and how they're going to use the resources you give them. You should provide a range of examples. So when providing historical earnings data, about the network, provide data from a range of franchises. So don't just focus on your best performing, look at the low performing and show them both. Focus on your regional and metropolitan areas or your inner city and suburban areas. So make sure they have a holistic idea of the whole business and how it's operating. Alternative, you can use averages rather than only figures of well-performing franchisees, just to give a more realistic representation of the potential earnings that the franchise might derive. When you are providing any information, we recommend providing it with disclaimers, particularly when there's historical earnings data. And, you should be clarifying the figures that they're not guaranteed and that they may vary based on individual circumstances and market conditions, just to be sure. And then, yeah, provide context on the information. So offer context for historical earnings data, explaining any factors that may have influenced past performance, things like location, market trends, economic conditions, just giving them, again, a holistic image of performance across the network as a whole. And then I think now we're going to talk about mapping and marketing the expansion process.
Thanks, Corinne. Yeah, so we've established, I guess, the fundamentals around what our strategy looks like, but the next part of that, I guess, is the business plan or the development plan. So if you're wanting to grow your network, you actually need to have a plan that you can execute. The way we go about doing that is we use territory mapping. So we use Mango Maps as an interactive software program. We have a full-time GIS specialist that maps all of the clients' businesses that we work with. So we identify those proven concepts that they've got. So we look at their existing network and identify which of those stores are doing well and what is the criteria that determines the success of that particular location. And from that, we're able to map what other likely successful locations or territories might look like. So we take the successful franchisees and we even look at the ones that maybe aren't working quite so well and look at things like household income, proximity to shopping centres or shopping strips, household income, demographics, are they close to other traffic generators? So there's a whole lot of factors that constitute developing the territories. And when you can actually create those territories and show them to a potential franchisee, it gives them a little bit more confidence that you've put the research into determining where you're going to locate that franchise. So that forms part of your development plan. So once you've actually identified it, you can actually map those territories based on the best performing and then prioritize where you want to advertise. So once you've created the map and you know where the best performing potentials are, the next slide is going to talk a little bit about, well, how do we actually advertise? So we've identified the territories, but we want to be really targeted in our approach around how we spend the advertising dollar to attract the franchisee. So I see a lot of people that use the scattergun approach and put ads up all over the place. You actually need to be really targeted. And if you've done the territory mapping, then you know where the top performing potential locations are. So you can get very targeted with your advertising campaign. You need to understand what platforms are out there and how they perform by industry. So we work across all industries: food, education, early learning, health, fitness, and trades-based businesses, and different platforms perform differently. So it's really important to understand where is the best place for you to be marketing. And then when you're marketing just in those territories that you've identified as those priority territories. You want to spread your dollars across multiple platforms, but you need to understand what platforms work. And happy to have a conversation with anyone about our observations and experience in that we, in the last 12 months, have worked with 30 brands on their recruitment across all industries. You need to monitor your costs. You need to know what you're spending. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what is a fair amount of money to spend, because return on capital is really important when you're looking at advertising. So you need to monitor your costs. A lot of the platforms will want to lock you into longer term contracts of say 6 or 12 months. Negotiate hard. They need your money. So I would the least or the shortest term we've been able to achieve is a 3-month platform, and that gives you the opportunity to pivot if you need to. There's been some talk about shows, and we've seen them go up and down in recent years. We do all the franchise shows both here in Australia and internationally. And particularly Melbourne and Sydney this year were phenomenally successful. We had 6 of our clients promoting and advertising their business at the show in Sydney last weekend. And I've got to say that this year the shows they outperformed the last 4 years. So consider the show. I always think that if you get one franchise out of a show, it's a good show, and anything more than one, it's a great show. And then just like what we're doing today with webinars, the opportunity to showcase. I think what COVID did was forced all of us to stay home and to get online. So there's a place for webinars. We had a very successful webinar yesterday for one of our clients, and the franchisor was very happy. They only had 10 participants, but 8 of those participants are moving forward to the next stage. So webinars work really effectively in managing both your time and the time of the prospective franchisee. So we've done the advertising. We know where we're going to advertise. Now I'm going to hand over to Corinne to talk about, what things can or can't we do? What should we avoid?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So obviously, yeah, when you are advertising and marketing the franchise, it's important to avoid doing certain things that may be, an issue down the track. So one of the first things that I recommend you try and avoid is misleading and deceptive conduct and making misrepresentations. So avoid making false or misleading statements to potential franchisees about the franchise opportunity, and particularly about potential earning capability. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if it's wrong, then it gives the franchisee a right of claim against you later on down the track. Try to avoid high pressure sales tactics. Do not use high pressure sales tactics to push potential franchisees into making quick decisions. You should be allowing them sufficient time to review all relevant documents, to seek legal and accounting and even business advice in relation to the opportunity that you're providing them. You should also avoid taking non-refundable deposits. If you've worked with us before, you know that that's something that I give you advice on quite regularly. So, pursuant to the franchising code, any monies that are paid by a prospective franchisee to the franchisor, including any deposits, must be fully refundable until the franchise agreement has been entered into or commenced operating. So just keep that in mind. Usually during this, advertising process and that application process, you'll ask them to pay a deposit. Just keep in mind when that deposit can be retained by you and when it should be refunded. I've mentioned a little bit about misleading and deceptive conduct and what that looks like, and I will now want to talk about how to avoid it. So there's a few ways you can avoid that. The first one is be clear in your communications with the franchisee prospect. Ensure that all the information provided to them is clear, accurate, and definitely not inaccurate. Avoid exaggerating potential earnings or downplaying risks associated with the franchise opportunity. It's just never going to work out well for you or them if you're, not clearly communicating, you're vague on details. And usually I find when we're involved in that process, we often get a lot more questions from franchisees because they don't know what's going on or they've heard different things and different answers. Ensure that you provide full disclosure. So be transparent about the franchise business, including any past franchisees, any legal disputes, any financial performance issues, and any challenges that the franchise system has faced. Remembering that you have to provide a disclosure document under the code, and a lot of these things will be provided in that document anyway. So there's no point in being quiet about it and hoping that they read it in the DD, because often they will read it and they'll get legal advice and then they'll start asking about it anyway, like why you've lost so many franchisees recently. And then, avoid or look out for written representations. So you should be documenting all your representations made during the recruitment process and avoid misunderstandings or disputes later on by having a paper record of all the communications. So don't start saying things outside of the contract or telling the franchisees certain things. If you're going to say something to them, have it in writing, communicate in writing, just so that everybody's on the same page all the time. And then the last thing I just want to talk about is what exactly constitutes misleading and deceptive conduct, particularly in a franchise recruitment setting. So things that would likely constitute it are things like inaccurate profit projections. So making exaggerated or unrealistic claims about potential earnings or success rates. That can definitely be misleading and deceptive. Another thing is concealing relevant information. Again, withholding important details about the opportunity, such as past legal issues or financial difficulties as well. And then, misrepresentations of your brand strength. So don't overstate the strength, popularity, or market demand for the franchise brand, as it can be deemed misleading or deceptive conduct to prospective franchisees. So now that I've hit you with all of that, Doug's going to start talking a little bit about the recruitment process, and then at the end, I'm going to talk about the commercial and legal considerations.
I talked about, I guess, the advertising, and what I want to cover now is the budget and how do you actually manage that to get the outcome that you're looking for. And it really starts as part of your overall franchising strategy and understanding, what's the network growth that you're looking for. So if you want to achieve 2 franchisees in a year or 10 or 20, how do you actually do that? So obviously the strategy, and I'll outline some of the steps in terms of how you do that. But in terms of from a financial perspective, I said earlier that the value of a franchise system is based on the recurring revenue model, which comes back to the quality of the franchisee. But often we take advantage of the initial franchise fee, which is great to get if you're getting a chunk of money, 30 to 50 grand or whatever it may be. But that really should be used as your advertising budget to attract the right franchisees. So you need to clearly understand how many franchisees that you want, and then you need to work backwards, because it is a little bit of a cookie cutter. With all the brands we've worked with, we pretty much know what it costs in order to get a lead, and then how many leads we need to have in order to get somebody to move forward to the next stage, and then what the cost per acquisition is. And so they're the sorts of things that your development team needs to know. So you need to set a budget, you need to know how many franchises you want to achieve, and then how much funding do you need to allocate in order to get that. So you need to be realistic. I talked earlier about the difference between recruiting internally or using an external company. So I'll talk a little bit about if you were to use an external company like us. I can share with you some stats, not on the particular brands, but on industry verticals, so that we know when a client comes to us and says, Doug, my goal is to have 5 franchises this year. We know their industry sector, we know what platforms to advertise them on, and we know how many leads we need to see. And we'll often say to them, you need to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince. So we do a lot of kissing for you, but we know what the cost is to recruit. So to give you some idea, across all of the brands that we've worked with, that have worked with us for over 12 months, our average cost to the client to engage us to find a franchisee is about $16,000. Now, it's been said for a number of years that the average cost of recruitment is around $20,000 or more, depending on how much time your team puts into that. So you actually need to understand that the cost of acquisition for a franchisee, what it is. And then I mentioned earlier about the difference between doing it internally or externally. We had a client that was spending about $300,000 on internal wages and then spending another $20,000 a month on advertising. And we were able to put a proposal to them and cut their costs by down to 1/10 of what they were spending and still achieve the same results. So look at what you need internally, because you do need people that understand your brand, that live and breathe it and can nurture those leads that come in. But there's a real benefit in using an external company as well. You need to know what the cost per lead is by each platform. So we've got, if I think of our most successful client that we've worked with, we've signed 10 franchisees for them in the last 10 months. And our cheapest or the best performing platform for them costs around $55 a lead, and then we've had them on other platforms where it can cost up to $200. So we know that we can pivot and move them off that platform and move them onto the platforms that are giving us a better yield. So really understand what is the cost per lead per platform. And even though cost per lead is important, you actually need to understand what's the cost, the conversion rate. So even if it costs you $200 to get a lead, but you're converting more of those types of prospects, then it may make sense to spend that $200 to get that lead on that particular platform. But you need to understand the cost per platform, the cost per lead, and then what is the cost to convert that person. And I can share some statistics with anybody that's interested in terms of, by industry, what do we see in terms of number of leads, cost per lead, and cost per acquisition. So we've done quite a bit of detailed analysis around that, having been recruiting now for 3 years across more than 50 brands. So that's the budget piece. So we've talked about advertising and the platforms and the money that you spend. Now I want to hand back I'm going to talk about, we've got the lead. Now, what do we actually do with that lead? So this is really just best practice, and we're seeing real changes in the industry. There's a couple of platforms out there where they're utilizing artificial intelligence and autoresponders. So at a minimum, having an autoresponder. So if a lead comes into your database, that it automatically sends an email that says someone from the team will make contact with you within 24 hours. So that's the minimum benchmark, because the reality is if someone's applying for a franchise, they're probably talking to other people. And depending on the competitiveness of your industry, whoever gets them first is going to make the best impression. Our average, we're actually having conversations with prospects that come into, as a lead that comes into our database in under 4 hours. So that's what you're up against if you're doing this internally, is how quickly are your team getting to those leads as they come in. And that goes to the touch point piece. So every single interaction or engagement that they have with you and your team, from the ad right through to the contact, the email, the phone calls, really demonstrates your professionalism and the desire of that prospect to want to continue on the journey with you. So once you've got that lead in, you need to be really, really clear in setting expectations for the prospect. So if you don't have a flow chart in terms of what's going to happen, what's the likely timeframes, then I'd encourage you to document that so that the franchise prospects knows what's going to happen, and you're giving them an indicative timeline in terms of what it might look like. But I always say emphasize that it will take as long as you need in order to make sure that this is the right thing, but show them what the journey is going to look like so they understand the expectations. I think it's really important that those franchisees, and this comes back to the idea of granting the franchise rather than selling it, is that they actually need to put a business plan together. Hopefully you've got a financial model that you can give to them so they can do some modeling. And then when they come to you and present that business plan, you can actually take them to task a little bit and get them to give you, what is a low or mid or a high forecast, and then what are the activities that they're going to do that's going to support that. So you want them to present a business plan to you. Usually you get them to do that on a discovery day if you're doing discovery days, where you get them into your office, they get to meet the key executives, and it's a two-way interview process. In an ideal world, if you can show them what a good franchisee looks like, so maybe even inviting your best performing franchisees into that discovery day, there's some real benefit in that so that the franchisee can see whether they can see themselves in your network. We also talk about on-the-job evaluations, giving them the opportunity to go into store or onto location prior to a discovery day or as part of the discovery day, so they can physically hands-on see whether it's right for them, but at the same time your team can look at them and see if they're going to be right for your network. And that's where it's really good to get an existing franchisee involved, so they'll give you some really honest feedback. And then the last part of that recruitment process is the validation piece. So that's giving them the opportunity to talk to other franchisees and to find out exactly what they need to know. So they come in with their eyes wide open about the network and how the existing franchisees feel. But at the same time, those franchisees that are answering questions of the prospect are actually evaluating that prospect and hopefully giving you feedback as to whether they think they might be a good fit. So that's the process from an operational perspective. Now I'm going to hand back to Corinne to talk about the process from a legal perspective.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, Doug. So, you've got your franchisee and you're pretty happy with them. You've gone through the process that Doug just described. So what do you need to do? What should you consider from a legal perspective during that franchise recruitment? So the first thing to keep in mind is the franchising code of conduct. If you're not familiar already, franchising is regulated in Australia. So familiarize yourself with the franchising code of conduct to ensure compliance with the disclosure requirements. There are a particular amount of things that you have to do as you onboard your franchisees to be legally compliant. So we always recommend, again, working with a lawyer to ensure that you meet the code obligations during that process. When it comes to the franchise agreement, you should ensure that it includes the commercial terms that have been disclosed and agreed with the prospective franchisee. It happens quite common where we'll, as a lawyers, we'll get the instruction, we'll draft the document, and then the franchisee comes back and said, no, I was told that this, and this, and this would be included. So then we'll have to redraft the documents again. So just make sure that you are clear on what you've agreed with the franchisee and make sure that that is reflected in the documents that they're signing. Keep in mind the disclosure document in the key facts sheet. So ensure that these franchise documents are up to date and include the necessary financial disclosures about the costs of operating the business, as well as the financial disclosures relevant to you as a franchisor that you have to provide about your own profitability and your own financial history. Then as well, the business structure and the guarantee. So determine the structure the franchisee will operate under, and if necessary, ensure that the prospect has sufficient assets to personally guarantee the financial obligations of the franchisee. It's sometimes they'll incorporate a company, and we always recommend that the directors and shareholders of that company are personally guaranteeing the performance of the franchisee entity. So get an understanding of their business structure. It's really important, and often encourage them to go get accounting advice about that structure as well. When you're ready to start, handing them your information, we always recommend you start with getting them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So that means once the leader's been qualified, get them to sign an NDA before you begin telling them the details of the franchise model, the equipment, the details of suppliers, before you provide the ops manual, before you start training them, giving them your recipes, or even letting them know about your systems and processes. I really emphasize this just because I do know franchise networks and I've seen it happen multiple times where competitors actually make inquiries with other networks in order to find out their information. So having them sign an NDA is the first step that you should be doing, just to ensure that you protect the intellectual property and the value that you've spent so long building up in your brand. You should not tell them all of your confidential information and trade secrets too early on in the recruitment process. Rather, you should drip feed this information little by little over the course of a number of meetings. And that will also help protect the confidential information and trade secrets should the lead also decide not to proceed with the franchise opportunity. I've even seen ones where they've gotten through that process and then they've tried to rip off some of the documents, like a warranty form for equipment and things like that. So again, it's really important. Now, remember the disclosure process. So provide all necessary franchise documents and make sure that you're complying with the franchising code of conduct by preparing and providing the franchise documents to the prospect, including any lease documents, loan documents, or any other related ancillary agreements necessary for the operation of the franchise business. It's really important to do that all in one go rather than to do it piecemeal, because then you basically have to redisclose and provide the franchisee with another 14 days. And that kind of leads to the next point, that there is a 14-day disclosure period. So ensure that you comply with the required disclosure period to allow the prospective franchisee to seek legal, accounting, and business advice in relation to the franchise opportunity prior to signing the franchise agreement. So just make sure that they're given that 14 days. You should not be signing within that 14-day disclosure period. And during that period, really make sure that you're giving them every single document that's going to be relevant to the franchise offer. The amount of times where franchisees suddenly get a document and start going, what is this? I've never seen it. I've never been told about it before. And we have to restart the 14-day disclosure period. So try and avoid that. And then also answer questions honestly. So we've talked about this a little bit, but just be transparent and candid when responding to any questions the prospective franchisee may have during the disclosure process, keeping in mind that you want to reassure the franchisee about the opportunity, but avoid any misrepresentations or misleading and deceptive conduct. And then the final thing that I would talk about is just other precautions and considerations during the recruitment process. We recommend that your legal representative issue the franchise documents to the prospective franchisee, just to ensure compliance with the disclosure period and to manage any negotiations and proper execution of the documents. I'm sure Doug's seen this a lot as well, but we'll get a lead, the franchisee is ready to go, we'll get all the documents issued, and then the agreements just never get signed by the franchisee, or they take 6 months to sign something. So always recommend you make sure that you have someone else, like a lawyer, involved that can manage that process and ensure everything's effectively executed. Make sure you assess the financial viability of your franchisees and the franchise model, and avoid exaggerating potential profit or likelihood of success to prospective franchisees. And then maintain accurate records of your communications with prospective franchisees and the recruitment process generally. That way your franchise documents should be reviewed and updated annually in accordance with the code by your legal representative. And then, the franchisee is getting a proper and full offer of exactly what your business is at that point in time, rather than, a document that's outdated or needs to be updated to comply with the code, as you have to do annually anyway. And that actually should conclude the main part of the webinar. So you might find our publication useful. You can access it in the handout panel or by scanning the QR code that's on this screen here. And then, as we mentioned earlier, anyone who registers for a free legal consultation with LegalVision will also receive a copy of Doug's latest franchise book, Invested. So just make sure you provide your contact details in the survey at the end of this webinar to get that free book. And then we also have an upcoming event that may be of interest to you on cracking the due diligence code, insider tips of buying businesses. And that's going to be coming up on Thursday, the 31st of August. You can register at the link on the screen as well. So we're going to answer your questions shortly. We'll leave you a little bit of time to submit them. So while you're doing that, we'll take a minute to tell you about our membership and to provide Doug's contact details. So LegalVision's membership is a cost-effective alternative to expensive hourly rates you experience with a lot of other law firms. For an affordable monthly fee, you receive cost certainty and all-inclusive legal services. That includes unlimited document reviewing, including drafting, amending, and reviewing of business contracts and commercial leases. It includes unlimited advice consultations with our team of over 100 specialist lawyers, including business structuring, employment disputes, more like franchising, and then unlimited domestic trademark registrations as well. As a LegalVision member, you won't worry about the cost of lawyers ever again. Think of it as having your own in-house legal counsel. We'll take care of the business as usual legal work so you can focus on running your business. And if you are an in-house counsel, our membership is a cost-effective solution for outsourcing additional legal work as well. So yeah, to learn more about how membership can help you, request a free consultation when the survey appears at the end of this webinar. And then, yeah, if you want to take advantage of Doug's extensive experience in working with franchisees, you can reach him at the contact details on this slide. These will also be sent in our post-webinar email along with a copy of the recording. Great. And then I think now we're going to answer some questions that have come through. I'm just going to pull them up. I think this first one looks like it's definitely for you, Doug. So this question is, what advertising platforms perform better? Does it depend on industry? For example, is there a better place to advertise for food franchises or trade franchises?
Yeah, good question. It's a hard one to answer because you've sort of got to experience it. Like we see a lot of our clients that go off and do their own advertising, and you know, they're not even tracking their cost per lead. But we know that, you know, if I use Facebook as an example, you can get a lot of leads from Facebook at a very cheap price. So the average, because we do Facebook advertising for some of our clients, you know, the average cost per lead on Facebook is about $12.13. And you compare that with the other advertising platforms. So we're on 12 different platforms for our clients. But it's been a trial and error thing. We've been doing the franchise recruitment for multiple clients for nearly 3 years. And we've had to learn what platforms perform better based on industry, but also based on the brand. So yes, it's a hard thing to, you know, you've got a limited budget when you, particularly if you're an emerging franchisor starting out, it's like, where do I spend my money? And I see people going to certain platforms, and we have an advantage in that we're buying ads at least half the price that individual brands can buy it because of the volume we're buying. So we can actually get a better bang for buck. But you know, when we first started, we didn't know which platform worked best. But definitely there are different platforms that perform better depending on what your product or service is. And again, you know, if anyone wants to reach out to me and just ask me what our experience is around that, I'm happy to share that information, because we know that, you know, whether it be food or education or home services, you know, professional services, franchises, they all have different platforms and they all perform differently. But again, it's not just about the cost per lead, because, you know, you might get a $200 lead, but it actually converts versus getting, you know, $20, $50 leads that don't convert. So it's a balance of the two. But yes, definitely, in answering the question, I sound like a politician. I took 10 minutes to answer the question. Different platforms do perform differently, and they perform differently by vertical.
Great. And then this next one's also, I think, up your alley. How does recruitment practices vary from state to state or internationally? And what can we learn from international markets like the USA?
Yeah, I think I'll start there, Corinne. So we've spent quite a bit of time internationally, and we're part of this group called the Global Franchise Alliance, because we want to take Aussie brands overseas and bring international brands here. Probably the biggest difference is in other parts of the world, there's a much stronger focus on multi-unit franchising. You know, we call a multi-unit franchisee in Australia someone who's got 2 or 3 stores, and in America, it's someone who's got 100 stores or has multi-brands. So I think that's really the big difference. That helps networks grow a lot quicker. I was in the UK in April, and there was a brand that only had 5 restaurants open, but they'd sold 100 franchises to 10 individuals who bought 10 stores each. So the idea of area development or multi-unit, I think that's where we're heading here. It's much easier to deal with 10 franchisees who have 10 stores each than 100 franchisees that have 1 store. So that's probably the biggest difference. I think state by state, what I'd see is the parochialism. So if you're in Adelaide and you want to buy a cafe, then Chibo is probably the brand that you go to. Or if you're in Perth, it might be might be Dome or Mrs. Maud's, whereas we've seen those brands go interstate and not work. So I think that's probably the big difference at a state level, is the parochialism to that local brand.
Great. Our next question is, how can franchising help me scale up my business? From a legal perspective, I would say, the benefit of franchising is that you're able to expand without as much financial investment from you yourself. It allows for a more rapid expansion without you needing to, take out the leases on every premises and have the capital to do so, employ all of the staff. So that's one way it can help you expand more rapidly and in a way that still, creates a presence across the rest of, Australia or wherever else you're looking to expand. But Doug, is there anything else you'd add to that? Like, how can franchising help me scale up my business?
Yeah, I think it's capital would be the heading, and it'd be the financial capital that you need. So you're using somebody else's capital to grow your network, but obviously the key there is recruiting the right person. But then it's the human capital. Like we've all seen in the last 3 years how hard it is to get people, and so having franchisees who are invested in a business means they're not going to go anywhere, and they tend to be closer to the network than if you're running corporate stores. And so you get a better output from a franchisee and typically from their team members, because they're working for an individual rather than a big corporate. So I think it's capital, the finances, but the human capital as well.
Great. Another one I think that suits you, Doug. We are just starting out and need to keep costs low, but would like to know the most effective as well as cost-effective way to attract franchisees.
Yeah, so I think the starting point for that is understanding what does it actually cost to get a franchisee. So we know across so we've recruited close to 60 franchisees this year across the brands that we work with. And we know that the average cost per acquisition has been $16,000 for those brands. And we always say when we set up a brand and we're doing the development work for a franchisor, you need to utilize the initial franchise fee as the advertising vehicle to get franchisees. So you need to allocate a budget, and we always say a minimum of 20 grand to get started. And if it costs you 16 grand, you might get one franchisee, maybe two, out of that initial investment. But I think we see a lot of clients that are bootstrapping. So what we always say to them is you usually will hire from your existing customer base. So it'll be customers that have come to you and said, hey, are you a franchise? They're the ones that might be interested. So I think you start internally. So start in the store. What advertising messages do you have on your packaging, on your menu boards? Do you have franchise brochures available in store? What are you doing on your own social media in terms of promoting the fact that you're franchising? So I think do all of the things that don't cost you a lot of money and that focus on your existing customer base rather than starting to spend money in a scattergun approach. But then just get really targeted around, okay, so where are people looking? Is a franchise show the right vehicle? Because there might only be one a year in each state, but you know that you're going to get, like if I use the Sydney show, there were 2,500 visitors through the show. And I think all the clients that we represented are really confident they're going to get a couple of franchisees out of it. So their $5,000 or $10,000 investment is going to pay tenfold. Start internally and then start to work out.
Yeah, great. I'm just going to let everyone know. So I think we're reaching the kind of end time, but we've got a lot of questions that have come through. So if you need to head off, that's fine. I think, Doug, I'm happy to stay on and answer the rest of these questions that have come through. So feel free to hang in there. And if not, feel free to go and we can organise and to have a consultation with you later if you follow the links. But if not, we'll keep answering these questions. So thanks if you have to leave now. But as far as the next question that I have, one of the things was, what should I do if my franchisee is the one pressuring me to rush through the franchise offer to them? I'll answer that one. Look, this happens quite often. You've got a really enthusiastic lead who's really ready to get in there and start doing things. I would just recommend make sure you're clear about the timeframes with them, slow down the process a little bit, tell them that, it works for them and you if the process is followed in a way that is definitely compliant with the legislation and with the code, and also, ensures that they can make an informed decision. I often tell people, it's kind of like buying a house. Like, we get excited and they are buying something. It's a new journey. So, you know, it's good that they're enthusiastic, it's good that they're ready to go, but you know, you wouldn't rush through just purchasing and spending all this money on a house. So you need to think about what that means and, you know, slow it down, keep them informed about the process. If you have, like, you know, provide them with a little bit of extra information about when to expect things and timeframes, but you know, be realistic about that as well. Another question was, when should you show the prospective franchisee the operations manual? That's a really good one, and I'll answer that one too. Doug might have a different answer, but mine is usually once they've signed a non-disclosure agreement. You know, legally speaking, it's just really important. Your ops manual is the bread and butter of what you're doing. It is essentially everything you have in your mind written down onto paper about how to effectively run your business. So I often recommend make sure they've signed an NDA before you give it to them. You can provide it once they've signed that as early or, you know, whenever you like, but I often recommend that until you have a signed franchise agreement on foot with them, usually I would say when you provide the ops manual, actually do it by way of letting them view it rather than like having a hard copy version, because I've seen, you know, matters where people have basically made a copy of it or retained it somehow. So don't give them a retainable version until, you know, they're part of your network, is generally my guidance. And make sure that they've signed an NDA as well and that they've signed the franchise agreement before you're actually giving them that document. Otherwise, just show it to them or let them click a link that it might be, you know, they can view it at, but they can't do anything with it. And then this one looks like it's for you, Doug. What type of financial KPIs should be used for discussing performance with franchisees?
I think it goes back to understanding what's best practice in your network. What are the best performing franchisees doing? What are your underperforming franchisees doing? But you typically, we will, when we're helping assist with the drafting of the legal documents, now we're not lawyers, but from a commercial point of view, when we're doing the financial modelling and building out what we think the structures should be, we clearly articulate what those key performance indicators are. So it's a combination of your best and worst performing. So it's about finding a middle ground. Obviously, we'd like everyone to be performing at a high level, but it's about also being realistic, understanding what is the average across the network, and that becomes the minimum standard. And then you write that into your ops manual, and then you refer to it in the legal documents.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I would say, like what Doug has said, when you're actually first creating your franchise agreement and usually working, you know, with a lawyer and also with a consultant like Doug, one of the things that we do factor in is what we call a minimum performance criteria. And we would generally recommend that, you know, you're realistic with that minimum performance criteria. And that you have really clear measurable performance metrics in order to assess the franchisee's performance. Otherwise, you know, you don't want it to be unrealistic and end up in a situation where you've got a franchisee who can't attain it, but you also don't want to be unrealistic where you know that it's so small that they actually aren't going to draw profit from the business. So you need to be really realistic about what you're putting in there and have a really tangible, measurable goal and KPI for them. Sometimes we do what we call a ramp-up period. So the start of the franchise, the KPIs or the minimum performance criteria would be like a smaller one, and then after the first year it will increase and then increase again incrementally. And that's sometimes a good way to show the franchisee that you understand it takes a while to start operating at a better margin and getting that money into the business. The next question was, is there a ballpark percentage to put a value on the franchise group IP? As in, I have heard IP represents 70% of the value of the business. So I'm also an IP lawyer, so I can speak to this a little bit. So ultimately, the value that you derive from the intellectual property is kind of difficult to assess, and you'd probably be better off working and speaking with your accountant about that one. However, I would say that the biggest asset that a franchise network has is its intellectual property and then the quality of the franchisees and those agreements with those franchisees. They're generally the main assets that you're holding. So IP does represent a very substantial percentage of the, I guess, all over value of your franchise group. And again, that value will be higher if you've adequately protected it. So keeping in mind, you know, if you've got trademarks, should be registering them and protecting them in that way. And then same as, you know, I've mentioned with your ops manual, which is confidential information, ensuring that you're not just providing that to anyone and everyone whenever they come through, but having, you know, procedures and processes in place in order to protect that valuable IP. But yes, specifically, I would say talk to your accountant about the way they assess your IP value, just because, yeah, it's quite hard to determine depending on what kind of assets you're holding. The next question is also for me, which is, do you provide franchise agreements for emerging franchises as part of the subscription, or is that extra? So yes, we will draft your franchise suite within the terms of our membership. And then we also within membership will do all of those franchise grants for you. So we give you all the tools that you need in order to start operating as a franchise network. And then we'll also give you what we call an instruction sheet. So once you've got your first franchisee, or, you know, Doug's recruited your first franchisee for you, then we actually will get what we call that instruction sheet. You provide that to us. We'll draft the documents for you, we'll issue them for you, we'll do those grants and follow them through just to ensure that you're compliant. And that's kind of the benefit of membership, is most other firms will just do one set of documents for you and then hand them over to you and send you on your way. Bye, good luck. We like to work with you on an ongoing basis. And then can you share a sample computation or equation for the average cost per franchisee, Doug? That's, I think, a question for you.
What I could do is if someone wanted to, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'll actually give, I'll do just a one pager, and that can actually say by industry what we see in terms of cost per lead, cost per acquisition, total cost per franchise. So I'll put a one pager together. So if you want to reach out, please do, and I can email you that that page, because I mean I can share you know, anecdotally what those numbers are. So like I've looked at 4 categories for today. One is service-based industries. We're seeing it's a 1 in 60, so 60 leads to get a franchise. Interestingly, the higher the price the franchise system, the better the conversion rate. So we're seeing 1 in 30 for businesses that are $800,000 or more. So I think what happens there is you actually get a different kind of person applying, because they know it's going to cost them more money. So the quality of that applicant tends to be better, so you don't have to get as many of them. In food, it's 1 in 100, so you've actually got to kiss 100 frogs to find a prince. And then in the education space, it's sort of 1 in 60, you know, to get someone in that educational, early learning, or children's area. So they're probably the 4 main categories that we recruit in. That gives you an idea. And then the average cost per lead for us across all platforms is $57.33. So if you use those numbers, you can see what it's going to cost you in theory to find a franchisee. But then it also comes down to advertising on the right platform, and how do you know what platform's right? So it is a challenge, but I'm happy to share our marketplace intelligence with anyone that wants to find that out.
Great. And then this is our final question that we've got, and it kind of relates to what you're just speaking about. But Doug, earlier you mentioned that I think there's about a 16K estimate that's generally spent on recruiting. Does that include the relevant documentation and financial modelling requirements to put the franchisee up for sale?
So the 16K that I referred to is, we as a recruitment business charge a monthly management fee, which is it's nominal. The franchisor pays the advertising costs, and so most of our clients are spending about $3,000 to $4,000 on advertising, and then we charge a success fee. So if you couple all of that up with all of the franchisees that we've found for our clients, it comes out at $16,000. Then there's some costs on top of that, obviously issuing legal documents. When we get a brand ready for franchising, we build the financial model for them. We do the territory mapping. So all of that's already done for the franchisor as part of when we get them ready. And I'm not sure if other franchise consulting firms do that, but you know, we feel in order to have a complete strategy, you've got to do mapping, you've got to do financial modeling, you've got to have everything in place, because then it makes the process of franchising easier.
Yeah, for sure. And then, yeah, just to kind of answer on the relevant documentation part, that's generally part of what we would do, the legal part of it. So not quite, I don't think that would be quite included in that. But yeah, I think that actually concludes our webinar, and I think, yeah, that's probably all we have time for anyway. So thanks if you stuck in there for the end of that. After the webinar ends, a survey will pop up. We would really appreciate if you could complete the 30-second survey. Please include your contact details to receive a complimentary legal consultation to discuss how we can help you with your franchise expansion. And also, obviously, if you're looking to touch base with Doug, just put in your message that you'd love to speak to Doug as well. We've provided his details, but still feel free to email us or put it in the survey. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope you got value out of everything we've presented. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.